What up? Welcome back to another video. This is something I never talk about, quite frankly, and I made a video not too long ago, I think, where I actually did discuss this particular brand of cameras. And since that point, I've worked on a couple more, I've shot a couple more. My thoughts have kind of matured a little bit. Let me grab my notes, because I did take notes for this. Well, we won't call it a script because that would be probably rude to scripts. I did want to talk about this because it's something I never talk about, which is of course not the best example, but Olympus OM1, and in greater part the Olympus line of cameras. This one's a little banged up, as you can tell here. It's missing the self-timer mechanism there, which, if you ask me, unneeded. But these cameras are very weird. Weird is not the right term. They definitely, I would say, Olympus marches to the beat of their own drum. So this was one of the first mechanical SLRs that was released post the Nikon F. It was actually released 13 years after the Nikon F. And what Olympus was going for was a much more compact and lightweight design, because if you've seen a Nikon F before, it's much larger. So Olympus was pitching this as a kind of counter to the Leica rangefinders, which were incredibly popular at the time. And this was a more subtle, sleek design, quieter to shoot. It wasn't going to be taking up a whole lot of room in your camera bag. All good things. Now, if you notice, it's called the OM1. The problem, though, is that a lot of Leica cameras are called M things, like M1, M2, M3, M4, M5, M6, M7, MP. I think there's more. I'm not entirely sure. I don't really follow Leicas that much, but the first iterations of these were actually referred to as the M1s, and the logos on them, I'll put up a couple examples here, look pretty dope if you ask me. Unfortunately, Leica was like, hey, maybe don't. So then they changed it to OM1, and that is the name that they kept for the duration of the line of cameras. This was presented in 1972, so it's a little old. Because of the old nature of it, I would say they hold up pretty good. I'm not a big fan of them, though. It's for a number of reasons. One, I don't really like working on these because of the compact nature of them. A lot of the mechanisms are very small and brittle and difficult to work with, and because they kind of kept with the same themes throughout the line of the OM series, it means that they all have kind of similar problems. If you know what I'm talking about, I'm referring to the advanced gear linkage for, I think it is the lever to the curtain, this mechanism down here. It's a whole thing. I believe I made a video. If I did, it'll be up here. If I didn't, then maybe I'll make a video at some point. The point being, though, is that these have many issues. And in bringing it back to me, my experience with camera repair, I didn't really work on these for a while. The first couple years or so that I was doing it was primarily focused on Pentaxes, Nikons, Canons, sometimes Minoltas. That's pretty much it. In Olympus, we just never really worked on too much. So by the time I kind of worked on all these other things and I got to Olympus, it's basically like Canon, Pentax, some Minoltas, it's all pretty basic, similar principles. Nikon, it's like everything that you would do in those three, just do backwards, do the opposite of what you're doing. In Olympus, it's like, hey, all the stuff you learned, forget about that. Good luck. Olympus cameras are just so unique to their own brand, which I respect, but at the same time, I don't like working on them for that reason. And we can go into that a little bit more, but I want to go back to the history of the Olympus cameras because it is kind of important to why I don't necessarily talk about them too much. Because you see a lot of the videos I talk about my more favorite cameras, like the Pentax MX, the Pentax ME Super. These are small cameras. I like them because they're easy to travel with. I like them because they're semi-reliable, except the ME Super. The MX is really reliable, all these things. So the OM1 should be a perfect fit. Mechanical, reliable, but mechanical, easy to work with, all this stuff. I don't like it. I just don't like the feel of it. I don't like the viewfinder. I don't like that this just kind of comes off. I mean, like, really? Really? You know? I don't like the ASA selection. I don't really like the advanced lever all that much. I thought I did for a minute, and then over time, I don't like how easily this gets marked up. I really don't like this, the backdoor release. I don't like the look of the back here. I don't like that there's no memos. Like very minor details that I don't like about this camera that anyone could look at and be like, oh, you're being dumb, like that's a good camera. And honestly, like, I agree. I also don't like the rewind switch. I think this is kind of a dumb position. It makes sense if you like tear the camera apart why this is where it is. I just don't like it. Because I began shooting Pentax SLRs, I just kind of carried in on that. The Olympus lenses too are fine, I guess. They're just weird. There's not a great healthy third-party system, so it's really kind of expensive to get other Olympus lenses. And then the third-party lenses that are out there are just like not great. For whatever reason, I just don't imagine, like the Olympus line didn't really catch on with people very much. And I think that is because they wanted to stick so much to like what they were doing, which worked out, like I would say to some extent, because then they released what in my opinion is one of the best jumps from one camera to the next in the same lineage, which is the OM2. This is an OM2N, so it's not, well, I guess, shoot, let me do the OM2. Wow, look at that. This is great. This is a really good camera released in 1975, which is only like 3 years after the OM1, but this was the first camera to offer TTL metering, which is through the lens, basically meaning whatever you're pointing the lens at, it is going to meter for that. And I believe this is a pretty center weighted metering system, but it does show that you have an auto setting, you have manual, but it will tell you kind of where you need to be, stuff like that. It has the worst ASA dial ever. This is stupid and I hate it. And I've made no bones about it. Like, I've talked about it quite a bit at this point, but it's a really dumb system and I dislike it. Again, the viewfinder to me is really dim. I'm not really a big fan of how it protrudes out from the prism. I just don't really enjoy the feel of this. I shot this camera last October, I believe it was, and I just never, I didn't feel a particularly strong bond to it overall. Now you'll notice that this is an OM2 and you're like, oh, well, what is the OM2N? This is basically the same thing. There's minor differences. The advanced lever is slightly different. You'll notice that there's a little bit more of a protrusion here. This one's a little bit more flat. I believe also the mechanism underneath is a little bit smoother. I'm not entirely sure. And then also this is a dual prong hot shoe, which means things that I couldn't tell you. I think essentially it was more compatible with certain flashes, but I don't really know exactly what, because I think it's one of those things that's kind of lost to time. I do know that, and then also I think the circuitry in here is a little bit better. Not like different, like I think they still serve the same functions. They still have a top speed of 1/1000th. Overall, these cameras are really good. These are very, very good cameras. I think, fuck. No, it's probably not important. I think that in terms of the OM1 to the OM2, I would definitely recommend an OM2 because it just offers so many more options. The only problem is these are pretty much electrical, so if you don't have batteries in, it won't fire, which is a bummer. But that's where the OM3 comes in, which I don't own, but we can pretend, right? Ooh, OM3. This was released in 1983 and only had a 3-year running time. It had more advanced metering, multi-spot metering, so it would basically take a bunch of different sections of the frame and say like, oh, based on all of these, this is what your exposure should be. But it was fully mechanical, which is beautiful. However, it didn't sell very well because the OM1N, which is the OM1 with some more fancies. Again, similar design, Similar thing with the dual prong little hot shoe deal. Nothing really notable. I think I have an OM1N somewhere. I cannot be bothered to find it, but basically the point being is because this was being offered at the same time still as the OM3, the OM3 didn't sell really well because the OM1N was still being sold for pretty cheap, and basically it serviced the same functions, very compact SLR. You will notice too that the size of these two is pretty comparable. I think actually it's the exact same size. The only difference here is the data back protrusion on the back, but for the most part, same size, which is pretty remarkable considering the step ups that this had, technologically speaking, electrically speaking, however you want to phrase that. So the OM3 Ti was then released in 1995, and it was basically the OM3 with a few minor details. I believe also a titanium body, which makes it a little bit more resilient, stuff like that. And that ran from 1995 all the way up to 2002, which is, I believe, when Olympus ended their film photography, film camera production, whatever. The OM4, I'm almost done, I promise. This is the last one, almost. The OM4 was then released in 1983 to 1987. And the best part about that is that it actually had a permanently fixed hot shoe, which is such a weird thing to like commend a camera for having. Like, oh my God, you figured it out. You have a hot shoe that's just on the camera all the time. This is a Spotmatic SP2 with a permanently fixed hot shoe. This camera was released in this year. I don't know off the top of my head. They already figured it out. It took Olympus until 1986 to figure out how to get a hot shoe just stuck on a camera, which I know they knew how to do beforehand, but still. It's weird to me that that wasn't a thing. And I understand they're trying to keep like this sleek design, but whatever. Okay. Great, permanently fixed hot shoe, weatherproofing, which is a huge bonus, especially when you're trying to pitch to a more professional market. Hey, I can take this camera out into a mud puddle and not have to worry about it. That's awesome. And then the OM4 Ti, which is again just another little step up, was released from 1986 to 2002, which is probably one of the best cameras that they made, and again ran until the conclusion of a series of Olympus film cameras. In my opinion, think about it like this: like the OM3 Ti is like the FM, and then the OM4 Ti is like the FE. One is more mechanical, one is more electrical. That's how they work. The OM4 also has like a really nice LCD screen, all this stuff. The problem though is that Olympus really failed to maneuver to autofocus 35mm SLRs, with every other brand doing so in and around 1985 when the Minolta Maxim 3000 or whatever was released, which is a garbage camera, but still, it was huge for the time. Even Pentax had the MEF, which was released in this year, I don't know off the top of my head, and that was a little gimmicky, but still it did show that there was a market for autofocus. And the problem too is that the autofocus like really made it a lot easier for professionals to use cameras, because that's one less thing you have to worry about, getting focus. And as that developed, Olympus just kind of got left behind. And a lot of manual camera lines were at that point dead by 1989. But Olympus was still out here churning out manual focusing cameras, which is fine, because I think that they hold up a lot better than a Minolta Maxim. Like, I'd much prefer to shoot with an OM1 than a Minolta Maxim. But the point being is, at that time, people were wanting the new thing. Like, you think about people now. People now are more focused on what new tech they can get, because they're looking in ways to improve their quality of life, even minimally. But point being is, that's what we're looking for, and like more immediate gratification. And looking back, like, there's definitely appeal to these like more mechanical, more solid bodied cameras, but it just didn't really translate well to those modern consumers. Yeah, because even if like you do have a professional that has like the whole series of Olympus lenses, you really have to go after the commercial, casual market of people, like, you know, mom and pa are going on a nice little trip to the Bahamas or whatever. What camera are they going to buy for that? Probably not an Olympus if they can get a little point and shoot thing for a lot cheaper from somewhere else that'll be a lot easier, and then they just have to send the film in, whatever. So the OM1's probably not going to be sold to them, the OM2's probably not going to be sold, whatever. Like, it's just, there's not that same blending. And then also same with like the student market. I just feel like there's a lot of other cameras that do that well. And now going back to me, because it's my channel, but going back to me and my opinion on these cameras, which are, again, perfectly fine cameras, I just don't really like using them. The repair principles behind these cameras are atrocious, and I don't like working on them because of that fact. There is a very slim margin to error on certain things, like if you remove the mirror box and you don't have the shutter speed set to 1/1000th, that basically bricks the camera, as far as I understand. I've not tried to break it because I don't have one that I can just break, because I don't really buy a lot of these. But from what I understand, there's like the spacing mechanism of your shutter speed selector, and then the selection on the bottom, the timing gears basically. And if it's not separated at the right shutter speed, then there's a delinkage or whatever, and then you have to kind of reset that. And like, that just, it's happened before, but you know, I'd rather avoid that. And then also with the OM1 especially, the battery wire corrosion is horrific because mercury batteries were a thing we used for a long time. The wire runs throughout the entirety of the camera, however, it is glued in. So you have to remove the mirror box, to remove the glue, to remove the wire, and then rewire the whole thing and hope that that works. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you have to replace all of the circuitry because, of course. So yeah, it's not like my favorite thing in the world. I do think that it posed a lot of interesting questions, it added a lot of competition to the industry. But then after a while, I don't think that they innovated as drastically as they did, even though they were the first to introduce a lot of these like really ingenious metering principles. That wasn't enough, and I think a lot of companies took those and kind of ran with it, and now we have like multi versions of that metering system and more compact bodies that are easier to use with higher shutter speeds, because that's the other thing too. I think a lot of these tap out at 1/1000th of a second, which is fine for most things, but other times, you know, kind of want to go a little higher, especially if it's a professional doing like sports photography or whatever. And yeah, I will just really never be able to forgive the OM2 for having this god-awful ASA selection meter here, and also for their continuation of using this really weird advanced levering system that will fail randomly. Not in like a drastic way, but basically when you shoot... Oh, is this dead? I think this is dead. Yeah. Sometimes it will just do that. Just very slow return for no real apparent reason. So in short, that's kind of why I don't talk about Olympus cameras. I don't really get a lot to work on. I don't really enjoy working on them all that much. And from what I can tell, they're not like very, very popular. Great cameras, to be quite fair. If you know how to use one, if you have the lenses for it, like honestly, you can make do with whatever you want. My personal opinion, I've not enjoyed shooting with them, and I've not really enjoyed working on them, but I've also not worked on them as much as I've worked on other cameras. So there was a lot of bias there, and I just felt like it was something I should probably talk about because it's been a while since I've talked about Olympus cameras. So I hope you find this relatively illuminating, if not slightly interesting, but I appreciate you watching regardless. And I think with all that said, I will just catch you on the next one.